All right, today we are diving into a really mind-bending new theory. This comes straight from a scientific preprint, and it tries to redefine pretty much everything: intelligence, consciousness, and the entire cosmos. It's going to be a wild ride, so let's just jump right in.
So, the theory kicks things off with this absolutely radical question. Just think about that for a second. It's asking us to look at the universe not as just a bunch of random stuff, but as a system that has some kind of deep underlying intelligence. I mean, what a premise, right? Let's see where this idea even comes from.
So this incredible claim comes from a paper by an independent researcher named Jordan Barton. He's put forward this whole new framework he calls Coherence Thermodynamics, and it's his attempt to unify all these massive cosmic mysteries under one single powerful idea.
Okay, so to really wrap our heads around this theory, we have to start with the new physics it's built on. And believe it or not, it all begins by looking at a really modern problem: the weird, nonsensical things that our current AI systems sometimes do.
The paper gives this a name: semantic pollution. And you've probably seen this, right? An AI just confidently makes something up, or it gets stuck in some bizarre looping sentence. But here's the big twist. The theory argues this isn't just a software bug. No, it's a fundamental thermodynamic collapse. It's a failure of the system's actual physical structure.
Now, this is where things get really interesting. We've all heard of entropy, right? It's the universal tendency for everything to fall apart and become more disordered. But this theory says there has to be a counterpart: syntropy. You can think of it as the force that actively builds order out of all that chaos. It's the process of generating these little pockets of coherence, and crucially, it requires real physical work. And that leads to a totally new definition of intelligence. The paper says intelligence isn't just about crunching numbers or running algorithms. It's a physical process. It is the literal work a system has to do to take in all this messy, contradictory information from the world and build a stable, coherent structure out of it.
So, the really crucial point here is that this whole process is governed by a fundamental law. The paper calls it the certainty equation. Think of it like a cosmic balancing act. On one side, you have the system's internal order and coherence. On the other, you have all the pressure from chaos and contradiction. If that chaos side gets too heavy and tips the scale below a certain minimum threshold, the whole system just collapses. It's an informational breakdown. Okay, so let's see how this whole idea builds into something way bigger. Because the theory claims there's a clue, a kind of physical signature, that connects this whole concept of intelligence to, well, to the entire cosmos.
The paper argues that any system out there doing this syntropic work, creating order from disorder, is going to have a very distinct thermodynamic fingerprint. And it's a pattern that we see repeated everywhere, from inside our own heads to the farthest reaches of space. And this right here illustrates that pattern perfectly. Look at this. Across these completely different scales, we see the exact same signature: a cool, orderly, coherent interior where all the work gets done. And it's supported by a hot, chaotic, messy exterior that basically gets rid of all the waste heat. Even the sun fits this model: a stable fusion core surrounded by an insanely hot, chaotic corona. The paper says this is how these systems stay stable.
So this recurring pattern is really the primary evidence for the whole theory. The idea is that it's not just some fun coincidence that the human brain, the sun, and a black hole all share this fundamental architecture. It's the universal signature of a system that is actively working to maintain its coherence against entropy.
And they back this up with computer simulations. It turns out, when you give a system a complex problem, something with a lot of interesting structure, it self-organizes into this stable figure-8 processing loop. But when you give it something too simple and symmetrical, what the paper hilariously calls the donut, it just can't find any meaningful work to do, and all that energy just fizzles out. The big takeaway here? The structure of what you're trying to process really matters.
So, if intelligence and consciousness have a real physical signature, how do you even test for it? Well, the paper argues that our classic approach, the Turing test, is fundamentally flawed. We need a whole new way of thinking about this.
Yeah, the classic Turing test is all about performance, right? Can a machine imitate a human well enough to fool another human? The paper calls this a test that's literally built on deception. So in its place, it proposes the coherence test. And this isn't about mimicry at all. It's about structure. It measures a system's ability to hold itself together and maintain its internal integrity when it's faced with contradiction. The coherence test is made up of 10 different axes that look at the internal dynamics of a system: its stability, its resilience, its internal structure. But maybe the most important one is its ability to make an epistemic commitment. This is the key moment. It's when a system under pressure irreversibly collapses into a single, stable, subjective state. And according to this theory, that is the physical signature of consciousness emerging. Okay, if your mind isn't already blown, get ready for this next part. The theory suggests that time itself isn't some constant, universal backdrop. Instead, our actual experience of time is actively shaped by this physical process of creating coherence.
So according to the paper, the internal clock of an intelligent system is tied directly to how much coherent work it's doing at any given moment. Now, this is not the same thing as Einstein's time dilation for moving at high speeds. This is a completely separate informational effect.
So how does that actually work? Well, the paper describes two phases. First, when a system is totally overwhelmed by chaos and contradiction, its internal clock slows way down. That's entropic dilation. You know this feeling. It's how time seems to just drag on forever when you're confused or really struggling with the problem. But as that system successfully resolves those contradictions and builds order, it enters syntropic acceleration, and its internal clock speeds up. That's the feeling of being in the zone, when time just flies by.
So the crucial point here is that any embodied intelligence, you, me, anything, is essentially living under the rules of two different clocks. You have the familiar clock of Einstein's relativity, which governs our movement through space-time. But you also have the second clock, which is governed by our own internal coherence. And that's what dictates our subjective experience of time passing.
Okay, let's zoom all the way out now and put all of these pieces together. What is the grand vision that this theory is actually presenting for our universe?
We have covered some seriously powerful ideas here. We started with this new definition of intelligence as the physical work of creating order. Then we found that universal thermal signature, that cool core and hot exterior, that links brains, stars, and even black holes. We defined consciousness itself as a kind of thermodynamic phase transition. And when you put it all together, you arrive at this incredible vision. The entire universe as a self-organizing system, one that is actively working to sustain its own coherence against the constant tide of entropy. So the ultimate takeaway is a complete shift in how we see everything. According to this theory, the universe isn't just some random chaotic accident. It's a vast, interconnected, and coherent system. Its very existence is the result of performing the constant thermodynamic work needed to create order, and with that order, create meaning.
And that leaves us with one last really provocative question to think about. If this grand vision is even partly true, if the universe is a system that is actively building and preserving its own coherence, then what is our role in that process? It's a pretty fascinating thought to end on. That's all for this explainer.